So I want to wake everyone up a little bit, make sure we're still paying attention. I know I tend to zone in and out in these conferences. Um, I am an active learner. I'm an active learning evangelist is the word I like to use because I try to infect everyone that I encounter with active learning. So let me share this with you. So, uh, what's the point of this picture? Just think about it, pop it into the chat, whatever. What do we see here? Okay, I'm sure you're thinking about it. We see an unexpected challenge with a myriad of solutions. And the reason I start with this is um, I live in southeastern Tennessee. So we have a lot of trains, a lot of trucks, a lot of farms. And the story behind this, not this picture, but the story I'm telling is that a truck got stuck under a railroad overpass, and of course, all the law enforcement was called, the trains were stopped. There were engineers brought in from the train company and the bridge company and the government. And then there was an old farmer who wandered over from his field and saw the situation. And as he was seeing the situation very differently than the engineers, literally standing on top of the bridge, the engineers were trying to raise the bridge. They were figuring out a way to raise a bridge 4 inches. The truck driver saw this very differently. He's used to working with simple tools, with difficult situations, unexpected things. And he said, "Why don't you just let the air out of the tires?" And that was exactly the solution. Someone went over, let the air out of the tires, and the truck went on its way. Of course, they had to reinspect the bridge before traffic was opened back up. My point today is that we can't raise the bridge. We can't change AI. We can't remove AI. What we're going to have to do is find solutions to combat this cognitive decline that we've heard so much about in other presentations. And I apologize, but my that is in the way of that. So let me try to move this. Everything works till you start presenting. Am I right? Okay. So I want to point you to a book that is very timely in its focus, even though it was written in 2017. I like to share a lot of read this later information. The young lady who shared earlier that she has a self-development plan. Mine is listening to smart people in my ear while I'm doing mundane things. I was actually painting my living room during the first half of this conference. I'm an active learner. But Joseph Oon wrote this book about robot proofing our jobs and robot proofing our students. And the culmination of his book was that higher education must evolve in the age of AI, but that instead of competing with machines, we have to develop human abilities that they can't replicate. What are those? To put it simply, Aoun said the people who can explain difficult things and communicate them in writing and in verbal speech are the ones who are going to run the companies that are operated with or by AI. Are students thinking less? Again, this conversation's been out there since at least 2011 was the first article I found talking about this. You can look these resources up later. Using AI allows us to bypass essential cognitive development steps. So it allows us to think more simply. Several people have already mentioned that, so I won't belabor the point, but it puts our critical thinking at risk, is the point that I want to bring back up now. And we've all been talking about that or we've all been reading about that and worrying about it for years. And then in March, MIT dropped this bomb on us that they've done a longitudinal study that said, guess what? Yes, reliance on AI to answer hard questions is making us less intelligent because, again, it's allowing us to take these shortcuts in learning. So, my question today for us is what can we do in our classroom that forces students to take these cognitive steps that are necessary in their own personal development as students? And I loved the way that one of these articles put this, that the feather tips toward concern. So AI is great, but AI is terrible. The feather tips toward concern unless traditional pedagogies remain. So that's what I am advocating here today is let's bring back some traditional pedagogies that have worked for thousands of years and use them intelligently to combat cognitive decline in the classroom. And the beauty is we can actually use AI to help us do that better. I'll show you how. But what we're trying to do, of course, is to protect higher order cognition. And notice that the mode that is suggested here is assessment reform. How do we assess learning is the thing that we can control. We can't control whether or not students are using AI outside of the classroom. They are, and if they say they aren't, they're probably lying about it because they don't want to be that person that uses it. So here's my proposition. Before and outside of class, students use AI as much as they want in whatever form they want, whatever AI they want. And they use that to gather multiple sources, to gather different perspectives. So if you think about building an assignment that requires students to use AI outside of the classroom so that when they come into what I'm going to call the air-gapped classroom, they have good information, then we're going to require them to validate their sources. So the simplest thing I could think of, just to use as an example, is rather than having the student write the 8 to 10 page paper at the end of the semester, let's have them do that 2 pages at a time throughout the semester. One topic, one topic, one topic, one topic, 4 different class periods. They bring all their resources in that they've printed out or handwritten. They bring their data in. They turn that in the form of an annotated bibliography. This gives us the opportunity to evaluate their sources while they are writing using those sources. Because this is iterative, 3 or 4 times throughout the semester, we can tell them after the first round what they've done wrong or what we think they could do better. Or we could tell them that, hey, this source didn't actually exist, or the AI interpreted it wrong. You should have read the abstract yourself, just to teach them how to use AI ethically. Inside the classroom, what I'm proposing is that we require them to handwrite essays. Now, it's funny. The president of our university, the day that ChatGPT dropped, when we all came back to the classroom in 2022, and at our first faculty meetings, we were like, "What are we going to do with this AI?" President of our college said, wouldn't it be great if there was this really low tech device that would allow students to use their fingers to put words on paper? Let's bring back the typewriter. I'm not against that. Of course, you can air-gap tablets, you can use lockdown browsers in a computer lab, things like that are appropriate. But what I'm going to argue in just a minute is that handwriting actually improves cognition. It slows us down, makes us think more deeply. We see our handwriting, we see the written word as a product of our thinking. But the other thing, obviously we want to preserve critical thinking. We want them to synthesize, evaluate, and summarize while they're writing. But the other thing that we need to remind them of is logic. And the good news is, let's see, there we go. So yeah, handwriting in class. The good news is the research supports this. Handwriting improves retention. Not necessarily immediate retention. It does improve that, but more importantly, it improves long-term retention. Do you want your students to remember what you taught them tomorrow, or do you want them to remember it when it actually matters in the workplace? Speaking their own ideas. I'm also reintroducing the idea of oral examinations. If you take an hour and 45-minute class period and break that up into 10-minute sections where students come to your office and tell you in 10 minutes what they need to tell you, maybe schedule some outside of class hours, that replaces an exam, for example, or a quiz or something like that. And of course, multimodal learning stimulates cognition. So if we have students spending 3/4 of the time writing their essays and the rest of the time telling their classmates about their essays, they're doing both. They're reading, they're synthesizing, they're evaluating, they're summarizing, and then they're speaking that. They hear themselves speak it. And let's see, what's on the next slide? Yeah, so handwriting versus typing improves retention, and speaking ideas increases mental organization. It takes a different set of skills, and this has been shown through active MRI. If you ever want to look that up and see the amazing results they're getting in that space, it takes a different set of mental skills to organize a thought and then speak that thought live than it does to write a sentence, revise the sentence, and then make it make sense. as we all know because we speak publicly for a living. The beauty of this is AI agrees with this approach. I asked AI in about a 2 hour conversation I had with ChatGPT, which is the one I think I've learned to use. You can read more about that here. I've opened this particular file up and I can share my presentation if anybody wants it for everybody to read. But AI says about itself, yes, I make people more dumb if they rely on me repetitively, but I can make them more intelligent if they use me well. And it also suggested, believe it or not, handwritten essays and oral examinations without me prompting it to do so. I just wanted to see if it would get to where I was. Um, Here's an example of how we can create an assignment like this. I just made this very generic as an earlier presenter did to give you an idea of what this looks like. I told ChatGPT I need a descriptive grading and assessment rubric for this assignment before class, students are to gather resources and prepare printed annotated bibliography to answer a complex global business question. During class, students are to handwrite a 2-page essay answering the question with sound logic, evidence, conclusions, and application. One thing that I have learned that AI, specifically ChatGPT and Notebook LM, are really good at is curricular design. They understand these models understand curricular design. They can read all the information that's been out there for eons about curricular design. So it created a 1-page rubric for the annotated bibliography that students would hand in. My advice is to give this to the students when the assignment is assigned, when it's explained. Tell them you need to have this out while you're creating this annotated bibliography that I'm going to grade because this is how I'm going to grade it. So in this step, they're using AI, but they're also using it with a set of parameters and expectations. In this step, ChatGPT is really good, like I said, at making descriptive rubrics. So I would hand the student this rubric and say, this is how I'm going to grade your paper. So as you handwrite your paper based on the printed material that you collected using AI, I want you to have this out and I want you to check yourself and see what, and another wrinkle you can add to this is actually have them evaluate their paper and predict their grade. And then really the discussion with the student is the difference between their prediction and how you've assessed it. So I think in the first iteration of this, it would be more, not necessarily be graded, more of a formative assessment. But as the semester progresses and as they become more familiar with this, really should be a summative assessment. One issue, as someone mentioned earlier, with using AI to help us with curricular design is getting the same results in the future. So I simply asked ChatGPT, how can I do this again and get the same results? So it gave me a prompt that it would recognize with the detail that it had added to my very generic result earlier. Yeah, my last little tidbit on this is sometimes AI will ask you to make a student version of something. So you can tell it that you want an instructor version and a student version. It will make the student version simpler. It will make the student version addressed to the student. It'll make the instructor version addressed to the instructor. It's really good at that. So I know that the automatic response when we start talking about in-class essays and grading oral exams is how am I going to have the time for that? How am I going to grade that? Again, the good news is using AI ethically, as we all will, we can use AI to help us do those things more efficiently to allow us to spend more time in class talking with our students. I love the fact that someone said earlier they only lecture for 20 minutes. Depending on the day, I may not lecture at all. I may lecture the whole time. It depends on the topic and how much I want students to interact with it. And I go back to logic for a moment. In some of my writing based classes, I teach mostly right brain classes, so organizational behavior and things like that, but I also teach operations management. I don't go through this in operations management, but in my more right-brained writing-based classes, I do go through the basics of logic. I do not have to teach them Aristotle or the 7 basic fallacies. but I do need to remind them what an evidence-based argument is. So this would be another example of something that I would give the students before I assigned the assignment, and that I would maybe hand them a copy as they walked in to write their test. I'm not the only one thinking this way. There was an article in Inside Higher Ed recently saying that amid AI plagiarism, more professors turn to handwritten work. So the sum of what I have today is that we need to sharpen our pencils. We need to go back to tools that have been useful for eons, and that we may have forgotten how to design well. We may have forgotten how to administer well, and we may have forgotten how to assess well. So at the end of all that, I'm not a luddite. I do not, I'm not one of those that says we don't need AI, we shouldn't use it. I think we can use it to our advantage, but we can also preserve the higher order critical thinking. Let me go back and say one more thing right here. When you're using AI to create these rubrics, the other thing that AI understands very well is Bloom's taxonomy. It is, after all, a large language model, so it understands the difference between evaluate, synthesize, define, apply. Identifying the level of Bloom's taxonomy and even the level of the student that you're interacting with is super helpful, and it will help you fill out some of those curriculum mapping gaps that that sometimes we miss when we're building assignments just on our own.